Hey, it's Alabama Annie with part 6 of the Starlight Tavern, one of my books available on Kindle. Settling into my new life. For the first week or so in my new room at the tavern, I had a little trouble falling asleep. I kept thinking about my mother and our cozy little house in Birmingham and Miss Martha next door, and I was terribly homesick. But Hattie would come into my room and sit with me after I'd had my bath each evening and put on my pajamas and robe, telling me a bedtime story, and we always said our prayers before I laid down on the pillow to go to sleep. But sometimes I still woke up crying in the middle of the night. After a while, I got used to the room, though. I liked sitting on the floor and playing with my toys, and on rainy days, I'd stay inside and lay in bed looking at books or playing with my dolls for hours. And at night, I loved to lay on my bed and look out the window at the stars. I loved to be in the kitchen with Miss Hattie, baking cookies or helping her with the dishes, and I enjoyed playing out under the trees on a rope swing Mr. John had made for me. I could swing high up into the branches of that big tree, and if I closed my eyes, I felt as though I was flying. Beyond the kitchen and our rooms at the back of the tavern was the public house, the part of the tavern where guests and visitors stayed, and just outside the swinging door of the kitchen was the dining room with a large table and 12 chairs in the center of the floor and two smaller chairs set beside the windows. All of the windows looked out over the side and front porch of the tavern, and Miss Hattie had hung a yellow lace ruffle at the top of each of them. There was also a china cabinet and sideboard where Hattie set out food for the guests. She kept the silverware and serving spoons there, as well as cups and saucers for tea or coffee and napkins. Sometimes in the morning, every chair at the tables would be full. And beyond the dining room, through a set of double doors, was the parlor. There was a big fireplace in the parlor, along with a sofa, several overstuffed chairs, some smaller tables, two rocking chairs, and, of course, the fireplace. Then there was the staircase leading up to the second-story bedrooms. There was a front door to the porch, which ran all the way around the front and sides of the tavern, and down a hallway beside the stairs was a closet, an office, a bathroom, and the service stairs, as we called them. When Mama and I had to come to be with Aunt Mary after Uncle Robert died, we had stayed in one of those rooms, and mainly they were used just for visiting guests and family. Guests did not rent them as a rule, but sometimes in a pinch they were. There were plenty of rooms for paying customers upstairs. At the top of the staircase were 8 more rooms and a bathroom at the end of that long, dark hallway. The hallway ended at the 2 bathrooms and turned left around a corner, and when I had to take up a basket of fresh towels or bring down the dirty ones that people left outside their doors to be collected, I hurried as fast as I could. There was no window to provide light in the hallway except for 2 at the top of the stairs and a window at each end of the hall. But some light came through the back staircase from the windows below, but mostly it was always dark and shadowy up there, even in the daytime. And the floors were creaky and crooked, and I would hear strange noises as I moved along, and I always thought something was waiting just inside one of those doors to grab me. I knew there had to be ghosts upstairs, but when I asked Aunt Mary if the tavern was haunted, she just said I had a big imagination and would change the subject. But I noticed, though, on those rare occasions when Miss Hattie would go upstairs for one reason or another, she'd always hurry along and she'd whisper things like, "Lordy Jesus," and "Give me strength." And I never did see her go up there at night, not once since I had come to live at the tavern. One morning at breakfast, on a rare occasion when Aunt Mary was up and having coffee, a lady who was staying with us asked if the tavern was haunted. I'll never forget what Aunt Mary said. She laughed and told the woman the tavern didn't have half as many ghosts as the old hotel across the way, and my imagination took over from there. I had heard about ghosts in my neighborhood at home. Aside from the pageant house, there was the foundry at the mill where my papa had died when I was only 4, and a boy at school told me a ghost story about a very mean old man they'd called Slag who had worked there, and that his ghost haunted that mill, and there had been the pageant house. One of my friends said that an old lady haunted that house. Sometimes, if you stood across the street from the pageant house and looked up at the second-story window from the sidewalk, you could see her there watching. And one day, when I was walking home from school, I did see her. So I tried not to look at those upstairs windows of the tavern, just like I didn't try to look at the windows of the pageant house when I was at home. When I was outside at the tavern, I was afraid I might see something. There were so many windows, and I just knew that eventually I would see something I would never forget. From a distance, all those second-story windows along the tavern looked like watching eyes. But downstairs, the tavern was much cheerier, surrounded on 3 sides by that wide sunny porch, and sunlight poured in through the windows of the dining room and parlor, and there was always a breeze in summertime. There were rocking chairs and swings on the porch, and I enjoyed them very much. I liked sitting on the front steps looking out at the fireflies in the evenings, and sometimes I would listen to Uncle John or William Post tell stories. I wasn't allowed to leave the yard of the tavern without asking permission after Uncle John had taken me on the walk around the place when I'd first arrived. I could visit Mr. Harvey at his cabin. He had a nice collection of arrowheads and fossils he'd found over the years that I loved to look at, but I always had to knock on his door and ask permission before I could visit. I could go to the barn where they kept all of the tools, and I could feed the chickens and gather fresh eggs in a basket from the pantry, or bring in the clean clothes from the clothesline on wash days, or pick tomatoes or peppers from the garden, sometimes for Miss Hattie. And I'd never broken my word about going to the river alone or crossing the road to the hotel, but I did break one rule on a hot summer afternoon. Everyone was napping that afternoon at the tavern. Hattie had been busy all morning baking for a church social the following day, and Mr. Harvey and Uncle John had been busy with the yard work all morning, and it was hot outside, and Aunt Mary was off somewhere with one of her social gatherings. I had been reading for a while in my room, and Miss Hattie had said I should take a nap, but I wasn't sleepy. Instead, for the first time, I walked out of my room into the hall and wandered out the side door of the kitchen onto the porch and stood looking around. Then I went down the steps and into the yard to my tree swing and spun around in it for a while until I was dizzy. Then I walked over to the edge of the yard, looked back to make sure no one saw me, and I crossed the lawn between us and the little church next door toward a pretty gray house I had seen through the trees one day. I'd asked Uncle John who lived there, but he hadn't said. The gray house was made of stone and timbers with tall fireplaces at either end and shuttered windows, and in the afternoon shade it looked like a cottage from a fairy tale. I walked into the yard of that house through the open front gate, along a stone walkway up onto the porch, to discover that the front door of the house was standing wide open. I crossed the front porch on tiptoe and stuck my head inside the door to see a long, narrow hallway with several rooms opening on either side, and though I knew it was wrong, I stepped inside, looking to my left at a large living room with a sofa and chairs beside a big fireplace, and to the right there was a fancy dining room with a large table and chairs, and a beautiful crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling, twinkling like lights in the afternoon sun. Past that room was a kitchen and a pantry, and across the hall from the kitchen was a library with books from ceiling to floor, with a small reading table and lamp in the center of that room. I ran my hand along those shelves looking at all of those books. There were more books there in that room than had been in my old school's library. I left there and moved past another doorway, peering into a room, and inside was a bed, a dresser, and a high-backed rocking chair. The back of the chair was facing the door. I froze when I saw an arm resting on the side of that chair, and in the light of the window, I could see a silhouette of a man's face in that light, and now I saw a pair of boots were visible below the chair on the floor. The man was obviously sleeping. His head was tilted to one side, and I could hear him quietly snoring as my heart raced in fear of being found out. So I reached down and removed my shoes then, moving ever so quietly back down the hallway toward the open front door again. And though I thought I had escaped without being caught, I heard the man say, "You must knock before you come into someone's house, Maggie." And I froze in the door, looking back to see if the man was coming, but he wasn't. Then I ran faster than I had ever run in my life, back through the gates and across the lawn and the lane to the kitchen porch again, and I thought I might be able to sneak back in and into my room and no one would ever be the wiser. But there was Hattie standing in the door of the kitchen with her hands on her hips, and she wasn't smiling. "Where have you been?" she demanded to know. And when I told her that I had gone to the house across the lane and said that there was a man inside sleeping in a chair, she shook her finger at me and took me by the arm. She told me I was lucky the man hadn't been an axe murderer or some criminal escaped from a jail, and shamed me for breaking the rules, telling me that I had trespassed on someone else's property, that I had entered someone else's home without permission, on top of leaving the yard and breaking Uncle John's rules and hers. "That house belongs to Aldous Wells," she said, "and he wouldn't like it if he knew what you had done," she warned. And I almost told her that he had known what I had done, that it was me in the house, but I bit my tongue. Hattie sat me down in the chair at the table. She said I should never, ever break any of those rules again and made me promise. Then she told me that as punishment for my crimes, I could fold all of the towels I brought in from the line earlier. She slid the laundry basket across the floor to me and said to get busy. And when I was done with that, she sent me up the dreaded stairs with all of them, trip after trip. Then, when I returned from that, instead of offering me my customary afternoon snack, she told me to go to my room for the rest of the day and marched me down the hall, closing my door behind me. I lay on my bed looking out the window toward that house, wondering how that man had known my name and if I could ever go back there again to see all of those books.